The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport cast harsh shadows across the crowded gate area as I settled into one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs that seemed designed to discourage any real comfort. Flight 447 to Los Angeles was delayed by 40 minutes due to weather conditions over the Rockies, which meant I had plenty of time to watch Bradley Morrison parade around the departure lounge like he owned the place. Bradley worked in the same marketing department as me at Horizon Tech Solutions, but that's where our similarities ended. While I had worked my way up from an entry-level position over the past 4 years, surviving on instant noodles and splitting rent with 3 roommates in a cramped Denver apartment, Bradley had been hired 6 months ago directly into a senior analyst role. His father was some big-shot executive at a Fortune 500 company, and Bradley never let anyone forget it. "Can you believe they're making us fly economy?" Bradley announced loudly enough for half the gate area to hear, adjusting the cuffs of his designer suit. Everything about him screamed money, from his Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than my monthly salary to the platinum watch that caught the airport lighting just right. "I mean, we're representing the company at the Morrison Industries pitch. You'd think they'd at least spring for premium economy." I looked up from my laptop where I'd been reviewing our presentation materials one final time. The Morrison Industries account was huge for our company, potentially worth $15 million over 3 years. Our entire team had been working on this proposal for months, and tomorrow's presentation could make or break several careers. "The budget for this trip was pretty tight," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Besides, it's only a 2-hour flight." Bradley laughed, the kind of condescending sound that made my jaw clench involuntarily. That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people in coach for life. You have to project success to achieve success. My father taught me that. He was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the runway, where planes were lined up like toys waiting their turn to take off into the Colorado sky. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the terminal in shades of orange and gold that should have been beautiful but somehow felt mocking in that moment. "Speaking of projecting success," Bradley continued, pulling out his phone to check something, "I've been thinking about the presentation tomorrow. Maybe I should take the lead on the financial projections section. I mean, no offense, but I have an MBA from Wharton, and you went to community college, right?" Actually, I had graduated from Colorado State University with honors, but I'd learned over the past 6 months that correcting Bradley's assumptions about my background was usually pointless. He had a talent for twisting facts to fit whatever narrative made him feel superior. "The presentation order was already finalized by management," I said, closing my laptop and sliding it into my carry-on bag. "We should probably stick to the plan." "Plans can change," Bradley said with a shrug that dismissed 4 months of preparation. "Especially when the stakes are this high. Morrison Industries isn't going to be impressed by someone who looks like they shop at Target." I glanced down at my outfit, a navy blue suit I'd bought at a discount retailer 2 years ago for job interviews, a white shirt that was starting to show slight wear at the collar, and black shoes that I'd resold twice to extend their life. Everything was clean and professional, but it was true that my entire wardrobe probably cost less than Bradley's tie. The announcement came over the airport PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready to begin boarding Flight 447 to Los Angeles. We'll start with our first class and business class passengers, followed by our premium members and military personnel." Bradley immediately stood up and smoothed down his suit jacket. "Well, this is where we part ways for a couple hours," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I upgraded myself to business class this morning. Can't have the client seeing me cramped up in coach, you know?" I felt my stomach sink. "Wait, you upgraded? I thought we were supposed to travel together so we could go over the presentation during the flight." "Relax, you'll be fine back there with the crying babies in middle seats," Bradley said, slinging his leather messenger bag over his shoulder. "Besides, let's be honest here, you'll never fly business class. People like you just don't understand what it takes to make that leap." "People like me." The words hit harder than they should have, carrying the weight of 6 months of subtle put-downs, dismissed ideas, and credit stolen for work I'd done. Bradley had a way of making "people like you" sound like a diagnosis rather than a description. "What do you mean, people like me?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Bradley paused at the gate entrance where a uniformed airline employee was scanning boarding passes for business class passengers. "You know, people who are content with just getting by. People who don't have the vision or the connections to really make it in corporate America. There's nothing wrong with that, it's just reality." He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent and disappeared down the jetway, leaving me sitting there with 20 minutes until they called my boarding group. Around me, other passengers were checking their phones, reading magazines, or sleeping in chairs that seemed designed by someone who had never actually sat in one for more than 5 minutes. I pulled out my own boarding pass and stared at it. Seat 23B. Middle seat in economy, squeezed between whoever got stuck next to me for the next 2 hours. The confirmation number at the bottom was wrinkled from being folded and unfolded multiple times as I'd checked and rechecked the flight details. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate back in Denver. "How's the big business trip? Living like the rich and famous yet?" I started to type back a response, then deleted it and typed again. "Getting there." Literally. But as I sat there waiting for my boarding group to be called, watching business class passengers walk past me with their confident strides and expensive luggage, I couldn't shake Bradley's words. Maybe he was right. Maybe there really was something fundamentally different about people like him and people like me, something that determined who got ahead and who stayed behind. The gate agent announced that they were beginning to board premium economy passengers, and I watched more people walk past me toward the plane. Each one seemed to carry themselves with a certain assurance that I wasn't sure I'd ever possessed, even on my best days. I thought about the presentation we'd be giving tomorrow, about the months of research and preparation I'd put into it, about the innovative marketing strategies I'd developed that could revolutionize how Morrison Industries reached their target demographic. All of that work, all of those ideas, and I'd still be sitting in 23B while Bradley networked with potential clients in business class. "Now boarding Group 4, passengers in seats 20 through 35, the gate agent announced. I gathered my things and joined the line of economy passengers, my boarding pass crumpled in my sweaty palm. In front of me, a family with 3 small children was trying to organize their carry-on bags and keep track of tablets and snacks. Behind me, 2 college students were comparing notes about their upcoming vacation in California. Normal people living normal lives just like me. But as I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent, something unexpected happened. She looked at the pass, then at her computer screen, then back at the pass with a confused expression. "I'm sorry, sir, there seems to be an issue with your seat assignment," she said, her voice professional but puzzled. "Can you wait just one moment while I check something?" Behind me, the line of passengers was beginning to back up, and I could feel people getting impatient. The gate agent typed something into her computer, frowned at the screen, then picked up a phone and had a whispered conversation with someone I couldn't see. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, looking up at me with a smile that seemed genuine, "there's been a change to your seat assignment. You've been moved to 3A. I stared at her, not understanding. "I'm sorry, what does that mean?" "It means you've been upgraded to business class, sir. Congratulations." The words didn't register at first. Business class. The same business class that Bradley had paid extra for, the same business class he'd told me I'd never experience, the same business class that was apparently reserved for people who weren't like me. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There must be some mistake." The gate agent smiled and handed me a new boarding pass. "No mistake, sir. You'll be in the second row window seat. Please proceed to the priority boarding lane." As I walked down the jetway, my mind was reeling. How had this happened? Who had authorized the upgrade? And more importantly, what was Bradley going to say when he saw me walk into the business class cabin? I was about to find out. The business class cabin of the Boeing 737 was a different world from anything I'd experienced in my 4 years of occasional business travel. Instead of the cramped rows of economy seats I was accustomed to, there were wide leather chairs arranged in a spacious 2-to-2 configuration, each with its own reading light, power outlet, and enough legroom to actually stretch out. I found my seat, 3A, and settled in next to the window, trying not to look like someone who had never been in business class before. Through the small oval window, I could see ground crew loading luggage into the cargo hold of our plane, their orange vests bright against the gray tarmac. That's when I heard Bradley's voice from somewhere behind me. "Excuse me, I think there's been some kind of mistake," he was saying to a flight attendant. His tone carried that particular edge of someone who was used to having service problems resolved immediately in his favor. I turned around and saw him standing in the aisle near row 5, holding his boarding pass and gesturing toward a seat where a well-dressed woman in her 60s was already settled with a cup of coffee and a magazine. "Sir, I'm showing that you're in seat 5B, the flight attendant replied, checking her tablet. "Is there a problem with your assignment?" "The problem is that I specifically requested an aisle seat when I upgraded this morning," Bradley said, his voice rising slightly. "I have a medical condition that requires easy access to the restroom, and middle seats are completely unacceptable for flights of any duration." The flight attendant, a professional-looking woman in her 40s with the patient expression of someone who dealt with difficult passengers daily, scrolled through her tablet. "I'm sorry, sir, but all the aisle seats in business class are occupied." I can see if there's anything available in premium economy. Premium economy? Bradley's voice cracked slightly. I paid full price for business class. I'm not being downgraded because of some computer error. That's when he noticed me sitting 2 rows ahead of him. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked distinctly like anger. "What are you doing here?" he asked, walking up to my row and staring down at me like I was an imposter who had somehow snuck past security. "I got upgraded," I said simply, trying to keep my voice casual even though my heart was pounding. The leather seat beneath me felt impossibly luxurious, and I was acutely aware of every detail: the way the armrests were positioned, the small amenity kit that had been placed on my seat, the glass of orange juice the flight attendant had offered when I boarded. "Upgraded?" Bradley's voice carried across the cabin loud enough that other passengers were beginning to stare. "How did you get upgraded?" "I've been a member of this airline's frequent flyer program for 3 years." I shrugged, genuinely not knowing the answer myself. The gate agent said there was a change to my seat assignment. I didn't ask any questions. Bradley stood there for a moment, his face turning slightly red. The woman in 5A was pointedly trying to ignore our conversation, but I could see her glancing over the top of her magazine with the kind of expression people get when they're witnessing an uncomfortable public scene. "Sir, we need to prepare for departure," the flight attendant said gently, placing a hand on Bradley's arm. "If you could please take your seat." Bradley shot me one more incredulous look before stalking back to row 5 and squeezing into the middle seat between the magazine-reading woman and a businessman who was already typing away on his laptop. I could hear him muttering under his breath, but couldn't make out the specific words. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, I found myself staring out the window at the Denver skyline receding in the distance. The Rocky Mountains stretched across the horizon, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring weather. It was a view I'd seen dozens of times from economy class windows, but somehow it looked different from row 3. "First time in business class?" asked the man sitting across the aisle from me. He was probably in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested he flew business class regularly. "That obvious?" I replied with a self-conscious smile. "Not obvious, just that look of someone taking it all in," he said with a friendly grin. "I remember my first upgrade. Changed my whole perspective on business travel. I'm Robert Chin, by the way." "Nice to meet you," I said, accepting his handshake. "I'm still trying to figure out how this happened. I was booked in economy and then suddenly got moved up here." Robert raised an eyebrows. "Random upgrades are pretty rare these days, especially on popular routes like this. You must have some serious frequent flyer status, or someone really important put in a good word for you." I thought about that as the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the Colorado sky. I didn't have frequent flyer status with any airline, and I couldn't think of anyone important enough to authorize an upgrade who would have any reason to help me out. "What line of work are you in?" Robert asked as the flight attendant came by with warm towels and a drink service that was far more elaborate than anything I'd experienced in coach. "Marketing," I replied. "We're flying out for a client presentation tomorrow. Biggest pitch our company has ever made, actually." "Morrison Industries by any chance?" Robert asked, and I nearly choked on my orange juice. "How did you know that?" Robert smiled and pulled out a business card. "Robert Chin, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, Morrison Industries. I'm the one you'll be presenting to tomorrow morning." I stared at the business card, feeling like the world had suddenly shifted on its axis. The client I'd been preparing to meet for months was sitting across the aisle from me, and I was meeting him in business class while my arrogant coworker was squeezed into a middle seat 5 rows behind us. "This is incredible," I said. "I mean, what are the odds?" "Actually, not that incredible," Robert said with a grin that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "I was reviewing the passenger manifest for this flight last night, saw that 2 people from Horizon Tech were booked, and asked our travel coordinator to see what she could do about upgrades. We like to take care of people who are coming out to see us. But there were 2 of us booked on the flight," I said, confusion clouding my understanding. Robert's expression became more serious. "Yes, I saw that. Bradley Morrison in 5B, and you in what was originally 23B. I asked our travel coordinator to upgrade both tickets, but when she called the airline this morning, they said only one upgrade was available." He paused to take a sip of his drink, letting that information sink in. "So she had to make a choice," Robert continued. "I told her to upgrade whoever had done the most work on our project proposal. She spent about 10 minutes on the phone with someone at your company, getting details about who was responsible for what parts of the presentation." My heart started beating faster. What did she find out? That you've been the primary researcher and strategist on our account for the past 4 months. That you've been staying late, coming in on weekends, and basically living and breathing this project. Meanwhile, your colleague Bradley was described as someone who provides input and reviews materials. I looked back toward row 5, where Bradley was trying to flag down a flight attendant while being largely ignored by his seatmates. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. So you specifically requested that my ticket be upgraded instead of his? Robert nodded. We believe in rewarding hard work and dedication. People who are willing to put in the effort deserve to be treated accordingly. As the flight continued west, Robert and I talked about everything except the presentation. He told me about Morrison Industries' expansion plans, their company culture, and his own background in marketing. He was warm, intelligent, and genuinely interested in my thoughts on various industry trends. Meanwhile, I could see Bradley in my peripheral vision, getting increasingly agitated as the flight progressed. He kept trying to catch the attention of flight attendants, pointing toward my seat and making gestures that suggested he felt some kind of injustice was being perpetrated. About an hour into the flight, he finally got up and walked to my row again. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. What's up? I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew what was coming. This is ridiculous, Bradley said, glancing around to make sure other passengers couldn't hear him. You're sitting in business class while I'm crammed back there like some kind of economy passenger. We're supposed to be representing the company as a team. I didn't ask for the upgrade, Bradley, I said. It just happened. Things like this don't just happen, he replied. Someone made a decision to upgrade you instead of me, and I want to know who and why. Robert Chin had been listening to our conversation with barely concealed amusement. Finally he spoke up. Excuse me, he said to Bradley. I couldn't help but overhear. Are you also from Horizon Tech Solutions? Bradley immediately straightened up and put on his most professional smile. Yes, I am. Bradley Morrison, Senior Marketing Analyst. And you are? Robert Chin, VP of Strategic Partnerships at Morrison Industries, Robert replied, extending his hand. I watched Bradley's face go through the same series of expressions I'd probably displayed when I learned who Robert was. Surprise, recognition, and then dawning horror as he realized he'd been complaining about seat assignments in front of the client. Mr. Chin, Bradley said, his voice suddenly much more respectful. What an unexpected pleasure to meet you. I was just discussing some logistical matters with my colleague here. I see, Robert said dryly. Well, I'm looking forward to your presentation tomorrow. I understand you've both put a lot of work into it. Absolutely, Bradley replied quickly. I've been leading the strategic development process for months. It's been a comprehensive effort to understand Morrison Industries' unique market position and growth opportunities. I felt my jaw clench at Bradley's casual rewriting of history, but Robert simply nodded politely. That's interesting, Robert said. Because when our travel coordinator called your company this morning to arrange the upgrade, she was told that the primary researcher and strategist on our account was sitting in seat 3A. The color drained from Bradley's face as he realized what Robert was saying. Not only had Robert been responsible for my upgrade, but he also knew exactly who had done the work on the Morrison Industries proposal. I think there might have been some miscommunication, Bradley said weakly. I doubt that, Robert replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Morrison Industries prides itself on working with people who earn their success rather than people who simply expect it. We'll see you both at the presentation tomorrow. Bradley returned to his seat without another word, and I could see him staring out the window with the kind of expression people get when they're realizing that the world doesn't work the way they thought it did. For the rest of the flight, Robert and I continued our conversation while Bradley sat in his middle seat, probably contemplating how drastically his assumptions about tomorrow's presentation had just changed. As we began our descent into Los Angeles, Robert turned to me with a serious expression. Can I give you some advice? He asked. Of course. Tomorrow's presentation is going to be more important than you realize. Not just for your company but for your career. Be prepared for anything. I nodded, not entirely sure what he meant but sensing that there was more happening here than just a lucky upgrade and a chance meeting with a client. As the plane touched down on the LAX runway, I realized that this business trip was going to be very different from anything I had experienced before. The Morrison Industries headquarters in downtown Los Angeles was the kind of building that made you feel small just walking through the lobby. 35 floors of steel and glass rose into the California sky, with a marble-floored entrance that could have doubled as an art museum. As I stood there at 8:30 a.m., adjusting my tie and trying to look confident, I couldn't help but think about how different this moment felt from what I had imagined just 24 hours earlier. Bradley stood beside me, fidgeting with his leather portfolio and checking his reflection in the polished marble walls. He'd barely spoken to me during the taxi ride from our hotel, and I could sense that yesterday's encounter with Robert Chin on the plane had shaken his usual confidence. "Remember, stick to the presentation order we discussed," he said quietly as we waited for the elevator. "I'll handle the opening and closing, you can cover the research sections. Just follow my lead and don't try to improvise anything." I nodded, even though I knew that the presentation order he was referring to had been his idea, not something we'd mutually agreed upon. He'd inserted himself into the most visible speaking roles while relegating me to what he called the data portion of our pitch. The elevator whisked us up to the 28th floor, where Morrison Industries' executive conference room overlooked the sprawling city below. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Hollywood Hills in the distance, partially obscured by the morning haze that was typical for Los Angeles in late spring. Robert Chin was already in the conference room when we arrived, along with 4 other executives I recognized from the research I'd done on Morrison Industries' leadership team. The conference table was a massive piece of mahogany that could easily seat 20 people, with high-tech presentation equipment that made our company's meeting rooms look like they belonged in the 1990s. "Gentlemen, welcome to Morrison Industries," Robert said, standing to shake our hands. "I'd like you to meet our executive team." He introduced us to Sarah Williams, Chief Marketing Officer, Michael Rodriguez, Director of Strategic Planning, Linda Foster, Vice President of Operations, and Patricia Hayes, Chief Financial Officer. Each one was accomplished, professional, and clearly accustomed to presentations from companies hoping to win their business. "Before we begin," Robert said as we all took our seats around the conference table, "I should mention that we've had a chance to review your proposal materials in detail. We're particularly impressed with the depth of research and the innovative approaches outlined in your strategic recommendations." Bradley immediately straightened up, clearly preparing to accept credit for work he'd had minimal involvement in. "Thank you, Mr. Chin. We've put considerable effort into understanding Morrison Industries' unique market position." "Yes, I'm sure you have," Robert replied with a slight smile. "We're looking forward to hearing more about your specific contributions to the project." As Bradley began setting up his laptop for the presentation, I noticed something unusual. The Morrison Industries executives were all looking at me rather than at him, as if they were expecting me to take the lead. It was subtle but unmistakable. "Actually," Robert said, "before we dive into the formal presentation, I'm curious about the research methodology you used to develop these recommendations. The market analysis section was particularly thorough." Bradley glanced at me, then back at Robert. "Well, our approach was comprehensive and data-driven. We utilized multiple research streams to ensure accuracy." "That's interesting," Sarah Williams interjected. "Could you walk us through the specific data sources you used for the demographic analysis of our target markets?" I watched Bradley's face as he realized he didn't know the answer to her question. The demographic analysis had been one of the most time-consuming parts of the project, requiring me to spend weeks diving into census data, consumer surveys, and market research reports from a dozen different sources. "The demographic analysis was quite extensive," Bradley said carefully. "Perhaps my colleague could provide some of the technical details while I focus on the strategic implications." All eyes turned to me, and I realized this was a moment that could define not just the presentation but potentially my entire career. "Of course," I said, standing up and moving to the presentation screen. The demographic analysis was built on 3 primary data sources: the most recent Census Bureau population surveys, proprietary consumer behavior data from Nielsen and Kantar, and industry-specific research from the Marketing Research Association. I clicked to the first slide of data I'd prepared, a comprehensive breakdown of Morrison Industries' target demographic across 12 key markets. "What we found was fascinating," I continued, feeling more confident as I got into material I knew inside and out. "Your primary customer base is aging faster than the general population, but they're also becoming more affluent and more willing to pay premium prices for quality products." Linda Foster leaned forward. "Can you elaborate on the regional variations? We've been seeing some unusual patterns in our sales data from the Southeast." "Absolutely," I replied, clicking to a detailed regional analysis. "The Southeast is actually your biggest growth opportunity. The demographic shift there is happening faster than in other regions, but your current marketing strategy isn't accounting for the cultural factors that drive purchasing decisions in that market." For the next 20 minutes, I walked the Morrison Industries team through research findings, strategic recommendations, and implementation timelines. Each question they asked led to deeper discussions about market trends, consumer behavior, and competitive positioning. I could see genuine engagement in their eyes, the kind of interest that suggested they were seeing ideas they hadn't considered before. Bradley, meanwhile, was growing increasingly uncomfortable. Every time he tried to interject with high-level strategic comments, the Morrison team would ask for specific details that he couldn't provide. "This is all very impressive," Michael Rodriguez said during a brief pause in my presentation. "But I'm curious about implementation. How do you envision rolling out these recommendations across our different product lines?" "That's exactly what I wanted to address next," I said, moving to a series of slides I'd developed but hadn't originally been scheduled to present. "The key is to phase the implementation based on market readiness and resource allocation." I outlined a 12-month implementation plan that included specific timelines, budget requirements, and success metrics for each phase of the marketing strategy overhaul. It was material I developed during late nights and weekends, diving deep into Morrison Industries' business model to understand not just what they should do, but how they could actually accomplish it. "Remarkable," Patricia Hayes said, making notes on her tablet. "You've clearly thought through not just the strategic vision, but the operational realities of execution." As I concluded my portion of the presentation, I realized that something had fundamentally shifted in the room. The Morrison Industries executives were no longer looking at Bradley and me as a team, they were clearly seeing us as two very different types of contributors to the project. "Thank you," Robert said as I returned to my seat. "That was exactly the kind of detailed strategic thinking we were hoping to see." "Bradley, did you have additional points you wanted to cover?" Bradley stood up, but I could see uncertainty in his posture. "Well, I think the presentation has covered most of the key strategic elements. I'd be happy to discuss any high-level questions about our overall approach." Sarah Williams smiled politely. "Actually, I think we'd like to dive deeper into some of the implementation details. The market segmentation strategy you outlined is quite different from our current approach. Can you walk us through how you developed those customer personas?" Bradley looked at me, then back at the Morrison team. The customer personas had been one of my most intensive research projects, involving dozens of hours of survey analysis and demographic modeling. "The persona development was quite complex," Bradley said slowly. "Perhaps it would be more efficient to have the person who handled the detailed research walk you through the methodology." It was a moment of professional honesty that surprised me. Bradley was essentially admitting that he couldn't answer their questions about work I had done. For the next hour, I fielded detailed questions about every aspect of the Morrison Industries proposal. Market research methodologies, competitive analysis, demographic trends, implementation timelines, budget projections, and success metrics. Each answer led to more questions, and I could see the Morrison executives becoming increasingly engaged with the conversation. Bradley contributed where he could, but it became increasingly clear that his understanding of the project was surface level compared to the depth of knowledge they were expecting. Finally, Robert Chen called for a brief recess. "We'd like to take 15 minutes to discuss what we've heard," he said. "Please make yourselves comfortable in our guest lounge and we'll reconvene shortly." As Bradley and I walked to the guest lounge, a beautifully appointed space with leather furniture and a view of downtown Los Angeles, I could see that he was struggling with what had just happened in the conference room. "That went well, don't you think?" he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I think they were engaged," I replied diplomatically. Bradley was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the city below. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How long did you actually spend working on this proposal?" I thought about the question. "Probably 60 or 70 hours a week for the past 4 months. "Why?" "And I probably put in 10 or 15 hours total?" "Something like that." Bradley nodded slowly. "They know, don't they? They can tell who did the actual work." Before I could answer, Robert Chen appeared in the doorway of the guest lounge. "We're ready for you," he said, but his expression was serious in a way that made my stomach tighten. Back in the conference room, the Morrison Industries executives had arranged themselves around the table with the kind of formal positioning that suggested they'd reached a decision. "First, let me say that we're impressed with the quality of work represented in this proposal," Robert began. "The research is thorough, the strategic recommendations are innovative, and the implementation planning shows a deep understanding of our business challenges." Bradley and I both nodded, waiting for what came next. "However," Robert continued, "we have some concerns about the team structure for this project." My heart started beating faster. Our expectation is that we'll be working primarily with the person who developed these strategies and who clearly has the deepest understanding of our business needs. Based on today's presentation, that person appears to be you, he said, looking directly at me. We'd like to move forward with this project, but we'd need assurance that our primary point of contact would be the person who's demonstrated mastery of both the strategic vision and the implementation details. I glanced at Bradley, who looked like he was trying to process what he was hearing. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Sarah Williams leaned forward. We're proposing a partnership with Horizon Tech Solutions, but with specific personnel requirements. The account management and project leadership would need to be handled by someone who's demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of our business and industry. The room was quiet for a long moment as the implications of what they were saying became clear. Of course, this would need to be arranged through your company's management structure, Robert added. But we wanted to be transparent about our expectations for how this project should be managed. Bradley finally spoke up. I think that's a reasonable request. Our company is committed to providing the best possible service to Morrison Industries. As we wrapped up the meeting and prepared to leave, Robert Chen pulled me aside. Can I give you some advice? He asked quietly. Please. When you get back to Denver, don't let anyone else take credit for what happened here today. This was your presentation, your research, and your strategic thinking. Make sure your management understands that. As Bradley and I rode the elevator back down to the lobby, I realized that everything about our working relationship was about to change. The presentation hadn't just been about winning the Morrison Industries account, it had been about establishing who had actually earned the right to manage it. And that question had been answered more decisively than I ever could have imagined. The flight back to Denver was a study in role reversal that I never could have anticipated. This time, I was the one sitting in business class while Bradley was squeezed into a middle seat in economy. Morrison Industries had insisted on upgrading my return ticket as well, a gesture that spoke volumes about their assessment of our presentation. As our plane lifted off from LAX and climbed into the California sky, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically the last 48 hours had changed my understanding of my own capabilities and value. The view of Los Angeles sprawling below looked different somehow, like I was seeing it from a new perspective that extended beyond just the physical elevation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Robert Chin. Excellent presentation today. Looking forward to working with you on this project. I've scheduled a call with your CEO for tomorrow morning to discuss the partnership structure. Partnership structure. Those words carried implications that I was still trying to fully comprehend. The business class cabin was quiet, with most passengers working on laptops or reading. I pulled out my own laptop and began drafting a detailed report of the Morrison Industries meeting, documenting not just what had been discussed, but the specific commitments that had been made and the expectations that had been established. As I wrote, I thought about Bradley's question in the guest lounge. They can tell who did the actual work, can't they? The answer clearly was yes. Corporate executives who had built successful careers knew how to distinguish between people who understood their business deeply and people who were just good at presenting other people's ideas. About an hour into the flight, I noticed Bradley walking up the aisle from economy. He paused at my row with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, a mixture of resignation and what looked like grudging respect. Can I sit for a minute? He asked, gesturing to the empty seat across the aisle. Of course. Bradley settled into the seat and was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the landscape passing below us. We were somewhere over the desert now, flying east toward Colorado, and the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the mountains and valleys. I owe you an apology, he said finally, his voice lacking the usual confidence and condescension that I'd come to associate with his communication style. What I said at the airport yesterday was completely out of line. I looked at him, surprised by the admission. Bradley, you don't need to. No, I do need to, he interrupted. I've been thinking about this whole trip, about what happened in that conference room today, and I realized something. I've been acting like success is something you inherit rather than something you earn. He turned away from the window to face me directly. You spent 4 months living and breathing the Morrison Industries project while I was coasting on assumptions about what my MBA and my family connections would get me. And today, in front of the client, that difference was impossible to hide. The flight attendant came by offering drinks, and Bradley ordered a coffee while I stuck with water. The brief interruption gave both of us a moment to process what was turning into the most honest conversation we'd ever had. Can I ask you something? Bradley said after the flight attendant moved on to other passengers. Sure. How did you know all those details? The demographic analysis, the regional market variations, the implementation timelines? I mean, I read the proposal documents, but you were talking about things that weren't even in the written materials. I thought about how to answer that question. I didn't just read research reports, Bradley. I called the data sources directly to ask follow-up questions. I spent weekends analyzing census data and consumer surveys. I stayed late reviewing Morrison Industries' financial reports and press releases going back 5 years. Why? He asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice rather than the dismissive tone I was used to hearing. Because I wanted to understand their business well enough to actually help them, not just well enough to sound impressive in a presentation. Bradley nodded slowly. And I wanted to sound impressive in a presentation. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the events of the past 2 days. Outside the window, the landscape was beginning to change from desert to the more varied terrain that indicated we were approaching Colorado. There's something else I need to tell you, Bradley said. When we get back to the office tomorrow, there's probably going to be some awkwardness about how to handle the Morrison Industries account going forward. What do you mean? I mean that Morrison Industries specifically requested that you be the primary point of contact, and that's going to require some reorganization of reporting structures and project management responsibilities. I felt a flutter of nervousness in my stomach. Do you think management will go along with that? Bradley smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, it seemed completely genuine. Let me put it this way. Morrison Industries represents the biggest contract opportunity our company has seen in 5 years. If they want you to manage the account, management is going to make sure you manage the account. But what about you? How does this affect your position? Honestly, I think it affects my position in exactly the way it should, Bradley replied. I've been skating by on credentials and connections rather than actual contribution. Maybe it's time I learned to do the work instead of just taking credit for other people's work. As our plane began its descent toward Denver International Airport, I could see the familiar outline of the Rocky Mountains rising from the plains. The same mountains I'd looked at from the departure lounge less than 48 hours ago, when Bradley had told me I'd never fly business class because people like me didn't understand what it took to make that leap. Bradley, I said as we prepared for landing, what you said yesterday about people like me not understanding success, what did you mean by that? He was quiet for a long moment, looking embarrassed. I meant people who didn't have the same advantages I've had. People who had to work their way up instead of starting at the top. But I realize now that I had it backwards. How so? People who have to work for everything they get understand success better than people who have things handed to them. You earned your seat in this cabin by doing work that impressed the client. I paid for my seat and then lost it because I hadn't done the work to deserve it. As we taxied to the gate at Denver International, I received another text message, this one from our CO. Heard great things about the Morrison presentation. Need to meet with you first thing tomorrow morning to discuss account management structure. Congratulations on landing the biggest deal in company history. I showed the text to Bradley, who read it and nodded approvingly. That's exactly what should happen, he said. You did the work, you impressed the client, you should get the recognition. The next morning, I found myself in the CEO's office at 7:30 a.m., still slightly disoriented by how quickly my professional situation had transformed. Margaret Stevens was a sharp, no-nonsense executive in her early 50s who had built Horizon Tech Solutions from a small startup into a regional powerhouse. I got a very interesting phone call yesterday evening, she began, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing her desk. Robert Chun from Morrison Industries called to discuss the partnership structure for their account. I waited, not sure what to expect. He told me that while he was impressed with our company's proposal, he was specifically impressed with one individual's depth of knowledge and strategic thinking. He said he'd rarely encountered someone who understood both the big-picture strategy and the detailed implementation requirements as thoroughly as you demonstrated in yesterday's presentation. Margaret leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of direct gaze that successful executives use to assess people. He also told me that Morrison Industries would like to formalize a partnership arrangement that goes beyond just this initial project. They're interested in a long-term strategic relationship, but they want assurance that you'll be the primary account manager and strategic consultant for all Morrison Industries business. My heart was racing, but I tried to keep my expression professionally neutral. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. It means you're being promoted to Director of Strategic Accounts, effective immediately, Margaret replied with a smile. It means you'll be managing not just the Morrison Industries relationship, but also leading our efforts to develop similar strategic partnerships with other major clients. She pulled out a folder and handed it to me. It also means a salary increase of 40%, equity participation in the company, and a budget to hire 2 additional team members to support the expanded scope of your responsibilities. I opened the folder and stared at the employment agreement inside. The salary figure was more than I had imagined earning for at least another 5 years. "There's one more thing," Margaret continued. "Morrison Industries was so impressed with your presentation that they've already recommended us to 2 other companies in their network. We have preliminary meetings scheduled for next month, and they specifically requested that you lead those presentations as well." As I walked back to my desk, clutching the employment agreement and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened, I passed Bradley's cubicle. He looked up from his computer and gave me a thumbs up. "How did it go?" he asked. "I think it went well," I replied, still somewhat stunned. "Good. You earned it." That afternoon, as I was organizing my new office, a real office with a door and a window overlooking the Denver skyline, I received one final text message from Robert Chin. "Looking forward to working with you on the strategic partnership. By the way, that upgrade to business class? That wasn't random. We believe in investing in people who invest in excellence." I set my phone down and looked out my new window at the city sprawling below. The same city where, just 3 days ago, I had been sitting in a cramped apartment, sharing expenses with 3 roommates and wondering if I'd ever advance beyond my entry-level position. The afternoon sun was reflecting off the glass buildings downtown, creating patterns of light that seemed to shift and dance as I watched. In the distance, I could see Denver International Airport, where this entire transformation had begun with Bradley's casual cruelty and Robert Chen's commitment to recognizing genuine achievement. I pulled out my laptop and began drafting a strategic plan for the Morrison Industries account, thinking about all the late nights and weekend research sessions that had led to this moment. All the times I'd questioned whether the extra effort was worth it, whether anyone would ever notice or care about the quality of work I was putting in. Turns out, people do notice. The right people notice when you do excellent work, just as they notice when you coast on credentials and connections without substance to back them up. As the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the Denver sky in shades of orange and purple, I realized that Bradley had been right about one thing. There really was a fundamental difference between people like him and people like me. The difference was that some people expect success to be handed to them, while others understand that success is something you earn through dedication, competence, and genuine contribution. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the people who matter can tell the difference.